It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. Just me, my best friend Drew, and the unbroken quiet of the dense forest around us. Drew had been the one to suggest the trip, saying it would do us good to unplug for a few days. We both had stressful jobs, and the thought of being surrounded by nature, with no emails or texts to worry about, was too tempting to pass up. We picked a spot far off the beaten path, a campsite near a freshwater stream and a small clearing. Drew was a little more experienced with camping than I was. He knew how to read a map, pitch a tent, and start a fire without too much effort. I mostly followed his lead, grateful for the chance to learn and eager to leave behind the noise of everyday life. By the time we set up camp and ate a simple dinner of canned chili, the sun was already dipping below the treetops. The golden light faded, giving way to a deep, inky darkness. Drew started a fire, and we sat beside it with a bottle of whiskey, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful at first, the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves creating a soothing soundtrack. Then Drew broke the silence. "I swear I saw something earlier," he said, staring into the fire. "What do you mean?" I asked, pouring myself another drink. "While we were setting up the tents, I thought I saw movement, like a person just beyond the tree line." I paused mid-sip, glancing toward the shadows. "Probably a deer or something," I said, trying to sound dismissive. "We're in their territory." He didn't respond right away, and I could see the flickering firelight reflected in his eyes. "Yeah, maybe," he said finally, but his tone was far from convinced. I laughed it off, but Drew's words stayed with me. There had been moments earlier in the day when I, too, felt a strange twinge of unease, as though the forest was holding its breath. I chalked it up to nerves, after all. This was my first real camping trip, and the unfamiliarity was bound to make me jumpy. As the fire dwindled and our conversation turned to lighter topics, the forest seemed to grow quieter. The sounds of insects and rustling leaves faded, leaving an unsettling stillness in their place. Drew noticed it too and glanced around. "Is it just me, or did it get really quiet all of a sudden?" he asked. "It's just you," I lied, trying to convince myself as much as him. We decided to call it a night soon after, retreating to our separate tents. Mine was set up a few feet from Drew's, and as I zipped myself inside, I felt a strange sense of vulnerability. The thin fabric walls didn't seem like much of a barrier against the vast, untamed wilderness outside. Still, exhaustion quickly overtook me, and I drifted off to sleep. Somewhere in the dead of night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was silent, the air cool and still. My first thought was that I had imagined whatever had woken me, but then I heard it, a faint rustling sound. It was too deliberate to be the wind. I froze, every muscle tensing as I strained to listen. The sound was coming from near the fire pit, just outside my tent. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling in the dark, and finally managed to turn it on. The beam of light pierced the darkness, but it barely reached beyond the mesh window of the tent. Then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the dying embers of the fire. It was tall and thin, its body cloaked in shadow. I couldn't make out its face, but the outline was unmistakable. A person, unmoving, just watching. "Drew?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the thudding of my heart. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, like a statue. I wanted to call out again, but fear paralyzed me. Then it moved, not toward me, but away, retreating into the blackness of the trees. The rustling of leaves faded, and soon the forest was silent once more. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every creak, every rustle, every shadow seemed like a threat. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I crawled out of my tent, stiff and bleary-eyed. Drew was already awake, sitting by the fire pit with a cup of instant coffee in his hands. "You look like hell," he said, eyeing me. "Rough night?" "I saw someone," I blurted out, not bothering with small talk. "Out there by the fire." His face went pale. "What do you mean, someone?" "A person. They were just standing there watching. And then they walked away into the woods." Drew set his coffee down, his jaw tightening. "I woke up in the middle of the night, too. I thought I heard footsteps, like someone circling the tents. I didn't want to check. I was too scared. We both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our fear settling over us. It wasn't long before we decided to pack up and leave, abandoning our plans to stay a third night. The idea of spending another night in those woods was unbearable. As we trekked back to the car, the feeling of being watched never left us. Every now and then, I would catch Drew glancing over his shoulder, his grip tightening on the handle of the hatchet he carried. I didn't dare look back. When we finally reached the car and loaded our gear, I felt a wave of relief. But as I climbed into the passenger seat and buckled my seatbelt, a strange noise made us both freeze. It was faint, almost like a low, guttural laugh carried on the wind. We didn't look back. We didn't speak. Drew started the car and we drove away, leaving the forest and whatever had been watching us behind. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. Last summer, I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I'd just gone through a bad breakup and needed some time to clear my head. The thought of disconnecting from the world for a few days, surrounded by nature, felt like exactly what I needed. I picked a state park that wasn't too far from home but far enough to feel secluded, with plenty of trails and less of a crowd than the more touristy spots. I arrived mid-morning on the first day and chose a site that was part of a larger campground, but set apart from the others by a short trail. It was perfect, quiet, surrounded by trees, with a clear view of the stars above. For the first night, everything went as planned. I built a small fire, made some instant noodles, and read by flashlight until I fell asleep to the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. On the second day, I decided to go for a longer hike. After several miles, I stumbled across an old fire pit and what looked like the remnants of a campsite tucked into a clearing just off the trail. There were no signs of people, no tents, no gear, but the area felt oddly preserved, as though someone had been there recently. The fire pit was surrounded by stones, with ashes and charred logs that looked fresh, but there was no one around. The place had a strange pull to it. It wasn't on any map, but it seemed like the perfect spot, isolated, quiet, and untouched. I decided to move my tent there, thinking I'd found a hidden gem. After hiking back to the main site, I packed up my gear and returned to the clearing, setting up camp by the old fire pit. That night, as the sun dipped below the treetops, the forest felt different. The natural symphony of chirping crickets and rustling leaves I'd grown used to was conspicuously absent. The silence was so complete that it felt oppressive, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the hours stretched on, the unease grew. The darkness felt thicker, the air heavier. I built a small fire to push back the shadows, but it didn't help much. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting just beyond the light. When I turned my head, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, I'd never camped alone before. It was probably just nerves. Eventually, I retreated to my tent and zipped myself in tightly. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling, straining to hear anything over the suffocating silence. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. A voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me," it said. My blood ran cold. The voice was weak and broken, almost like a child's. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight and check, but fear held me frozen. What if it was a trap? What if someone was trying to lure me out of my tent? My mind raced through every possibility, each one more terrifying than the last. "Help me," the voice called again, softer this time. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The fire had burned down to embers, and the clearing was empty. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The voice didn't call out again, and eventually, I retreated back into the tent. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away if someone or something was out there. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and sleeplessness. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees made my skin crawl. It wasn't until dawn that the forest seemed to come alive again, the chirping of birds breaking the eerie silence. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, the clearing looked exactly as it had the day before, quiet and undisturbed. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Faint footprints in the dirt, circling my tent. They were small, like those of a child, but no child should have been out here in the middle of the night. I packed up my gear in record time, the sense of unease growing with every minute. I decided to take a different trail back to the main road, one that would loop around the long way, but felt safer than retracing my steps. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often I would glance over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone, or something, lurking behind me. But the trail was always empty. About halfway back, I noticed something odd. The trees on either side of the trail were marked with strange carvings, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the bark. They hadn't been there on my way in, and I couldn't imagine how anyone could have made them overnight. The carvings only added to my sense of dread. I quickened my pace, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the clearing as possible. But no matter how fast I walked, the feeling of being watched never left me. Finally, I reached the parking lot where my car was parked. Relief flooded through me as I loaded my gear and started the engine. The hum of the motor a welcome sound after the oppressive silence of the forest. But as I pulled out onto the road, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the parking lot, half hidden among the trees. It was small and thin, its face obscured by shadow. I only caught a glimpse before it disappeared into the forest, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I never camped alone again. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. A few years ago, my girlfriend Claire and I decided to take a road trip to celebrate our 3-year anniversary. We planned to drive through a few national parks, camping at different spots along the way. Claire had grown up camping with her family, but I was relatively new to it. Still, I was excited to try something new and spend some uninterrupted time together. By the third night, we were deep in a remote area of a national forest. We hadn't planned to camp there. It was more of a last-minute decision. We'd lost track of time while hiking and realized we wouldn't make it to the next town before dark. Claire, ever the optimist, assured me it would be fine. "This is the kind of thing that makes road trips memorable," she said, flashing her signature smile. We found a small parking lot at the trailhead and decided to hike in far enough to set up camp, but not so far that we'd struggle to find our way back in the morning. The forest was thick and dark, the kind of place where the trees seemed to close in around you. With only the light from our headlamps to guide us, we trudged along the trail, the sounds of our footsteps muffled by the mossy ground. About 20 minutes in, we came across a clearing that seemed perfect. It was flat, with just enough space for our small tent, and there was already a fire ring made of stones in the center. Claire started setting up the tent while I gathered wood for a fire. By the time we had everything set up, the stars were starting to peek through the canopy above. The fire crackled to life, casting a warm glow that pushed back the darkness. We cooked a simple meal, just some canned soup and toast on a makeshift grill, and settled in to enjoy the stillness of the forest. The sounds of the night surrounded us. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional snap of a twig. "This isn't so bad," I said, leaning back on my elbows and looking up at the stars. Claire laughed. "Told you, you're a natural camper." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, letting the fire's warmth seep into our bones. But then, just as I was starting to feel completely at ease, a sound broke through the night. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight. Claire and I exchanged a look, her wide eyes reflecting the same fear I felt. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice firmer than I expected. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, a voice answered from the shadows. A nice night for a fire. The man stepped into the light, and I felt every muscle in my body tense. He was tall and wiry, with unkempt hair and a face that seemed both gaunt and wild. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he had a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows over his eyes. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something unsettlingly deliberate about the way he moved, like a predator sizing up its prey. "We didn't see anyone else on the trail," Claire said cautiously, her voice trembling. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around. These woods have a lot of secrets." He crouched down near the fire, warming his hands as if he belonged there. Claire edged closer to me, and I instinctively reached for the hatchet we'd brought for chopping wood. I kept it at my side, trying not to make it obvious. "You're not from around here," the man said, his tone conversational, but with an edge I couldn't quite place. "We're just passing through," I replied, forcing a polite smile. The man nodded slowly, his gaze flicking between us. "You should be careful. People go missing out here all the time." I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the hatchet. "Thanks for the advice." For a while, the man didn't say anything. He just stared into the fire, his face unreadable. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until he finally stood up. "Well," he said, brushing dirt from his pants, "enjoy your night." Without another word, he disappeared back into the trees. The darkness swallowed him whole, and the forest fell silent once more. Claire and I didn't sleep that night. Every time the fire started to die down, one of us would get up to stoke it, too afraid to let the light fade completely. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound, felt like a threat. We stayed huddled together, our backs against the tent, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. As soon as it was bright enough to see, we packed up our camp and started back toward the car. The trail felt longer than it had the night before, every shadow stretching too far, every sound too loud. We didn't speak much, our focus on getting out of the forest as quickly as possible. When we finally reached the parking lot, we were both relieved to see our car exactly where we'd left it. But as I loaded the last of our gear into the trunk, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A set of footprints, larger than mine, circled the car. "Claire," I said, my voice shaking. "Did you see anyone else out here when we arrived?" She shook her head, her face pale. "No, just him." I didn't need to explain what I meant. We both knew the man had been there, watching us, long before we ever saw him. The thought sent a chill down my spine. We drove away in silence, the tension in the car palpable. It wasn't until we were miles down the road that Claire finally spoke. "Do you think he followed us?" "I don't know," I admitted, glancing at the rearview mirror as if expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road. We never found out who the man was or why he was in the forest that night. But every now and then, I think back to his parting words. People go missing out here all the time. And I wonder if we were supposed to be next.